Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the incredibly intense anti-migrant protests that are currently unfolding across South Africa. We're relying strictly on the facts, the hard data, and the on-the-ground reporting to figure out exactly what's going on here. Right now, we are seeing businesses completely shuttered, heavy police deployments, and thousands of people literally fleeing their homes. It's a highly complex and, frankly, deeply human situation. So we're going to break it down for you step by step so you can fully grasp the forces at play. All right, here is our agenda for today. 1. The Tuesday deadline. 2. Arrests and unrest. 3. The root causes. 4. A history of xenophobia. 5. The mass exodus. And finally, 6. What happens next? Let's dive right in. Section 1. The Tuesday deadline. We're going to start right in the middle of the action with the specific catalyst for this current surge in tension. So things rapidly escalated when citizen-led anti-immigrant groups, organizations like Operation Dudula and March and March, issued a really firm ultimatum. Their demand was simple but incredibly severe: leave by Tuesday. These groups falsely claimed that any undocumented immigrants who didn't leave the country by this deadline would face immediate arrest and deportation. You can imagine the panic. This unofficial deadline created a massive wave of fear across neighborhoods with high migrant populations, and it pushed thousands to seek shelter at consulates or just flee altogether to avoid the violence. Now, the South African government immediately pushed back against these threats. President Cyril Ramaphosa firmly rejected the ultimatum. He stated quite clearly that while people absolutely have the right to protest and express their frustrations, that right does not give anyone a pass for intimidation, vandalism, or violence. He essentially called these citizen-led ultimatums exactly what they are: vigilantism. But despite the government's reassurances and high-level meetings to encourage peace, that Tuesday deadline remained a massive flashpoint. Section 2. Arrests and unrest. Let's look at how this all bubbled over into nationwide action on the ground when that Tuesday actually arrived. The scale of the response was literally massive. As Tuesday dawned, there were 120 separate marches taking place across the entire country. We saw huge mobilizations in major economic hubs, especially in cities like Johannesburg and Durban. Demonstrators from all walks of life, from working class to middle class citizens, took to the streets to demand government action regarding undocumented foreigners. Now, this breakdown provided by the National Police Commissioner is super important to look at. Out of those 120 marches, 108 were actually totally peaceful. However, 12 of them descended into unrest. In places like the Hillbrow and Yeoville suburbs of Johannesburg, police and even military soldiers had to be called in to intervene. We're talking isolated but serious incidents of violence: bricks being thrown through windows, a shootout that injured a 17-year-old, and the torching of vehicles. In response to all this growing chaos across those specific flashpoints, South African law enforcement had to act fast. On that Tuesday alone, police arrested more than 900 people nationwide. They actually had to deploy police reinforcements to 5 of the country's 9 provinces overnight just to maintain order and contain the looting. And this list right here really illustrates how complex the police response had to be. These arrests weren't just a one-sided thing. Sure, some individuals were detained for violating immigration rules, but a whole lot of others, locals who were participating in the unrest, were arrested for public violence, robbery, torching vehicles, and even unlawfully evicting residents from their homes. The authorities were dealing with a deeply volatile situation coming at them from multiple directions. Section 3. The root causes. To really understand this crisis, we have to look past the immediate clashes on the streets and examine the underlying socioeconomic catalysts driving both sides. Okay, so the crucial point grounding this entire situation, the undeniable economic reality, is South Africa's staggering unemployment rate. It currently sits at over 30%. Think about that for a second. When nearly a third of your workforce cannot find a job, the frustration and sheer desperation create an absolute powder keg for social unrest. People are looking around, asking why they can't get jobs, even when they have degrees, and that intense economic anxiety is constantly searching for an outlet. So we are essentially seeing 2 very different narratives colliding here. On one side, protest leaders are arguing that illegal migration is completely out of hand. They're blaming migrants for a spike in illicit drugs, for taking jobs, and for taking over informal neighborhood shops. But on the flip side, human rights groups like Amnesty International argue something entirely different. They point the finger at the lasting legacy of apartheid, persistent systemic inequality, and huge failures in the government's asylum and public service systems. Shamila Mohammed at Amnesty International really drives this point home. She warns that scapegoating foreign nationals and spreading misinformation about them only serves to distract from the government's actual responsibility to fix those deep systemic problems. From this perspective, the migrant population is basically just bearing the brunt of a much larger structural economic failure. Section 4. A history of xenophobia. Because, as we know, a wave of anger and displacement like this doesn't just happen overnight. If you look at this timeline, you can clearly see a tragic, recurring cycle of anti-immigrant violence erupting over the past 2 decades. Back in 2008, 62 people were killed in a horrific wave of rioting. Then we saw renewed attacks pop up in 2015 and 2016. In 2019, 12 people lost their lives when armed mobs attacked foreign-owned businesses. And now, in 2026, we're witnessing this current crisis. The tensions we're exploring today are built on a very long, very documented history of xenophobic friction. Section 5. The mass exodus. Now we have to zoom back in to look at the immediate human toll happening right now. Driven by sheer fear of violence, intimidation, and unlawful eviction, a massive exodus is officially underway. According to South African police reports, a staggering 25,000 migrants have been repatriated so far. Landlords and employers have actually been evicting or firing foreign nationals just out of fear of getting fined or having their own properties attacked. This has pushed thousands of people into temporary transit camps. And the cross-border logistics of this displacement? It's mind-boggling. Multiple African countries have had to scramble aircraft and buses just to rescue their citizens. We are talking about over 7,000 Malawians being moved out of transit tents in Durban. Nigeria has flown over 600 of its citizens back to Lagos. Meanwhile, you've got heartbreaking situations where over 200 Malawians are completely stranded in Mozambique. No money for transport, no shelter, just begging for aid to finish their journey home. Add in the fact that police have arrested roughly 50,000 migrants since January for being in the country illegally, and you really start to see the massive scale of this event. But macro data is one thing. Hearing directly from the people impacted is another. Take Emanuela Akagbasun, a 44-year-old Nigerian migrant who had moved to South Africa back in 2017. She told reporters that the shop she shared with her sister was completely ransacked and looted by anti-migrant protesters. As she so bluntly put it, "We are not safe, so we had to leave." Or consider the story of Fintan Opara. He was repatriated to Nigeria after building a life in South Africa for 18 years. Let that sink in for a second. Almost 2 decades in a country he called home, and he ultimately felt compelled to leave because he and his community just no longer felt safe walking down the street. Yet honestly, even amidst all this fear, the xenophobic slurs, and the very real threat of physical violence, there is still this incredible grace shown by some of those who are fleeing. Hassan Firi, a Malawian migrant waiting in a processing camp, offered this incredibly poignant message. Despite everything, he pleaded for African unity, saying that the continent must love each other and stick together because, in his words, Africa can't be Africa without South Africa. Section 6. What happens next? With thousands fleeing across borders and protest leaders literally vowing to march every single Thursday for the next 6 months, we really have to ask where this is all heading. Well, we can't look at this crisis without acknowledging the political calendar. South Africa has crucial national elections approaching this November. In a highly charged environment like this, the issue of undocumented migration has naturally become heavily politicized. While the president is calling for peace, observers are noting that other politicians across the spectrum are increasingly using anti-immigrant rhetoric to rally their voters. This means the political temperature on this issue is for sure only going to intensify in the coming months. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly tough thought to consider. How does any nation equitably resolve a crisis where extreme local economic desperation, like a 30% unemployment rate, collides directly with the fundamental human rights and safety of a vulnerable migrant population? It's a complex, heartbreaking question without an easy answer. But it's one that South Africa, and honestly the rest of the world, must grapple with. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.